number of people killed every day in the streets. Their message to us was do something. I don't know how many times we heard that.
And more illegal gun sales by unlicensed dealers. They don't have the required federal firearms license.
1 year since President Biden signed into law an historic gun reform agreement known as the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act.
But we begin here with the massive protests across the country against gun violence following the massacre.
You know, I'm about to sign into law bipartisan gun safety legislation.
Executive order and public response. The quote, "The final rule clarifies that even a single arm transaction may be sufficient to require a license," from the White House website refers to the implementation of an executive order signed by President Biden on March 2023, which directs the Attorney General to clarify the definition of who is required to obtain a federal firearms license, FFL, for selling arms for profit. This executive order is a response to the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act of 2022, enacted after mass slayings in Uvalde, Texas, and Buffalo, New York. The objective is to address armed violence by regulating armed transactions more strictly. The rule aims to expand the requirement for obtaining an FFL, potentially affecting individuals engaged in the unlicensed business of arms sales for profit. It estimates that roughly 20,000 individuals fall into this category, covering tens of thousands of arms sales annually. This rule is part of efforts to prevent arm-related tragedies and make communities safer.
You know, I'm about to sign into law bipartisan gun safety legislation.
A lot of these protesters I spoke to say they have a connection to a gun violence incident, making this fight personal.
A number of people killed every day in the streets. Their message to us was do something. I don't know how many times we heard that.
Slaughter is too easy in this country and it needs to stop.
However, there are concerns and criticisms surrounding this rule. Some argue that it could criminalize individuals who engage in occasional or one-time armed transactions without intending to profit from them. Others question the effectiveness of such measures in reducing armed violence, particularly when most criminals obtain arms through illegal means such as the underground black market. Statistics from a 2019 Department of Justice study provide context for these concerns. The study found that about 43% of criminals purchased arms from the underground black market, while only 0.8% allegedly obtained them from arms shows. This suggests that stricter regulations targeting legal arms transactions may not significantly impact criminals' access to arms. Additionally, there has been a significant decline in arms obtained from arms shows over the past 2 decades, indicating that stricter regulations may not address the primary sources of arms use in crimes. Vice President Kamala Harris emphasized the need for reasonable arms safety laws while affirming support for the Second Amendment. However, critics argue that the new rule may infringe on individuals' Second Amendment rights without effectively addressing the root causes of armed violence. While the intention behind the executive order and the subsequent rule is to enhance public safety and prevent arm-related tragedies, there are concerns about its potential impact on law-abiding citizens and its effectiveness in reducing armed violence. The debate surrounding arm control measures remains complex, with stakeholders advocating for a balance between public safety and individual rights. Separating fact from fiction. In recent years, discussions surrounding arms regulations have become increasingly polarized, with advocates and policymakers proposing measures aimed at curbing armed violence while also safeguarding Second Amendment rights. Amidst this debate, the issue of unlicensed armed transactions has emerged as a focal point, prompting legislative action and executive orders aimed at addressing perceived loopholes in existing regulations. The recent executive order signed by President Biden on March 10, 2024, and set to go into effect on May 10, 2024, seeks to clarify the definition of who is required to obtain a federal firearms license, FFL. The order aims to address concerns raised by incidents of armed violence, including mass slayings such as those in Uvalde, Texas, and Buffalo, New York. However, the proposed regulations have sparked controversy and debate, with critics arguing that they may inadvertently penalize law-abiding citizens while failing to address the root causes of armed violence. At the heart of the debate is the interpretation of statistics and the perceived effectiveness of proposed measures. Proponents of stricter regulations point to the data suggesting that a significant proportion of arms used in criminal activities are obtained through illicit means, including theft and underground markets. Additionally, critics argue that the focus on unlicensed sellers overlooks the fact that the majority of arms used in criminal acts are obtained through illicit channels, rather than legal transactions. Furthermore, the executive order has been criticized for potentially conflating different categories of armed transactions, such as those occurring at arms shows or between private individuals, with illegal trafficking. Critics argue that this oversimplification fails to account for the complexities of the arms market and may result in the unintended criminalization of law-abiding citizens engaged in legitimate activities. Another contentious issue is the impact of the executive order on individuals' Second Amendment rights and the broader arms community. Arms rights advocates argue that the proposed regulations represent an infringement on constitutional rights and could create additional barriers for law-abiding citizens seeking to exercise their right to bear arms. Moreover, critics question the efficacy of stricter regulations in addressing the underlying factors driving armed violence, such as mental health issues and socio-economic disparities.
And more illegal gun sales by unlicensed dealers. They don't have the required federal firearms license.
And proposes a bunch of laws that would do nothing to stop these murders.
In addition to the legal and constitutional implications, there are practical concerns regarding the implementation and enforcement of the proposed regulations. Critics argue that the administrative burden placed on federal agencies and law enforcement could divert resources away from more pressing issues and exacerbate existing challenges, such as backlog and background checks and delays in processing arm licenses. The debate over stricter arm transaction regulations highlights the complex and contentious nature of arm policy in the United States, while proponents argue that such measures are necessary to reduce armed violence and enhance public safety. Critics contend that they may infringe on individuals' rights and fail to address the underlying causes of crime. As policymakers continue to grapple with these issues, finding a balanced approach that respects constitutional rights while addressing legitimate concerns about public safety remains a formidable challenge. Addressing regulatory overreach. In the realm of arms policy, recent developments have sparked significant controversy and debate, particularly surrounding efforts to regulate unlicensed arms transactions. The executive order signed by President Biden on March 10, 2024, set to take effect on May 10, 2024, has drawn scrutiny for its potential impact on law-abiding citizens and the broader arms community. Amidst the rhetoric and political maneuvering, it is essential to dissect the underlying issues and assess the efficacy of proposed regulations in addressing the root causes of armed violence. One of the central arguments put forth by proponents of stricter regulations is the need to address the proliferation of crime arms and illicit arm trafficking. However, a closer examination of available data reveals a more nuanced picture. While it is true that arms obtained through illegal channels contribute to criminal activity, the scope of the problem must be contextualized within the broader landscape of crime statistics. For example, The assertion that 368 cases of unlicensed arm transactions warrant sweeping regulatory measures may be disproportionate when viewed in the context of metropolitan crime rates. Moreover, the origins of the proposed regulations, stemming from incidents such as the Uvalde school slaying, raise questions about their effectiveness in addressing systemic issues. The tragic events at Uvalde underscored failures in law enforcement response and highlighted the need for comprehensive strategies to prevent and mitigate mass slayings.
And the families who, in fact, were victimized by the gun shooting that we've seen this
Been 7 mass shootings across the U.S. since the killings.
1 year since President Biden signed into law an historic gun reform agreement known as the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act.
But we begin here with the massive protests across the country against gun violence following the massacre.
Moreover, the rhetoric surrounding arm regulations often reflects ideological biases rather than evidence-based policymaking. The notion that restricting access to arms will inherently reduce armed violence overlooks the complex socio-cultural factors driving criminal behavior. Additionally, the assumption that law enforcement alone can ensure public safety ignores the reality that individuals have a fundamental right to self-defense and protection. Overall, the debate over arm regulations requires a nuanced and evidence-based approach that balances public safety concerns with respect for individual rights. While efforts to address armed violence are laudable, policymakers must avoid regulatory overreach that penalizes law-abiding citizens without addressing underlying systemic issues. By fostering open dialogue and engaging with diverse perspectives, policymakers can develop more effective strategies to promote public safety while safeguarding constitutional rights. That's all for this video, folks. See you next time.